The midday heat of 1994 did not care that it was her 18th birthday. It beat down unmercifully upon the dusty roads of Eldoret, Kenya, baking the red earth into a cracked, unforgiving pavement that mirrored the sudden fracturing of Amina Okoro's world. She stood on the edge of the tarmac, her breath catching in her throat as she stared back at the wrought iron gates of her parents' compound. The gates had clicked shut with a definitive, metallic finality, a sound that seemed to echo louder than the passing matatus and the distant hum of the town's bustling markets. On the dirt beside her worn canvas sneakers sat a single, bulging plastic safari suitcase, its zipper strained to its absolute limit. No explanations had been granted, no tears shed by the elders, and no final blessings whispered. There was only the locked gate, the scorching Rift Valley sun, and the sudden, terrifying realization that she was entirely on her own. To understand how Amina found herself cast out into the wilderness of the world on the very day she crossed into womanhood, one must understand the unyielding expectations of the Okoro family. Her father, Tunde, was a senior administrator at the regional university, a man whose life was governed by rigid schedules, leather-bound ledgers, and an absolute devotion to social standing. Her mother, Zainab, was a respected head matron at the district hospital, a woman who measured the value of human existence by the crispness of a uniform and the predictability of a career path. They were not cruel people in the eyes of the community. Indeed, they were pillars of the local church, donors to the neighborhood clinics, and citizens who prided themselves on their stable, middle-class respectability. They had provided Amina with a comfortable home, sent her to a strict girls' boarding school, and raised her to be polite, hard-working, and quietly ambitious. But the Okoros were also people who had fought tooth and nail to escape the poverty of their youth, and because of that battle, they possessed a deep, fundamental fear of any path that did not guarantee a monthly salary and a respectable title. They had mapped out Amina's life before she could even walk. She was to study law or medicine at the university in Nairobi or, at the very least, pursue a career in corporate finance. They wanted her to hold a position that commanded authority, a role with a clear hierarchy and a predictable income. They did not want her to be a storyteller. They did not want her to be a weaver of proverbs, which is precisely what Amina was born to be. To her parents, writing and collecting the oral histories of the old ways was not a profession. It was a distraction, a foolish indulgence of the mind that could not feed a family or maintain a household. The tension within the compound had grown like a slow, suffocating smoke as Amina progressed through her final years of schooling. She kept her marks high, scoring straight A's across her examinations because she knew that maintaining academic perfection was the only shield she had against the fragile peace of her home. But every spare moment she possessed, every hour stolen from her textbook revisions, was dedicated to her true calling. Amina was an only child, a quiet girl who preferred the company of shadows and old tales to the loud gossip of the town squares. She sat at the back of her classroom, observing the subtle shifts in her teacher's expressions, the way the wind moved through the acacia trees, and the rhythm of the local market women's bartering. She noted everything without ever raising her voice. She filled exercise book after exercise book with poems written in the local dialect, short stories capturing the fading traditions of the countryside, and fragments of folklore she gathered from anyone willing to speak to her. She began entering national youth writing competitions, and when she was 16, she won a prestigious prize from a cultural magazine in Nairobi. When her parents read her prize-winning story, they adjusted their spectacles, told her it was a nice hobby, and immediately asked if she had completed her applications for the pre-law common entrance exams. The breaking point arrived in the early months of 1994, just as the long rains were beginning to threaten the horizon. Without a word to her parents, Amina applied to a highly competitive creative writing and cultural anthropology program at an international institute in Dar es Salaam. It was a sanctuary for young African artists, a place that treated the preservation of stories as a sacred duty rather than a useless pastime. She was accepted on a partial scholarship, but when the official acceptance letter arrived via the post office, it was her father who intercepted the envelope. He slit it open at the dining table, read the contents in absolute silence, and placed the paper face down on the polished mahogany wood. That evening, her parents sat in the main sitting room for over an hour, speaking in low, urgent tones in a traditional language that Amina only partially understood, for they had deliberately raised her to speak the refined English and Swahili of the educated elite. When they finally called her into the room, the verdict was absolute. They would not pay the remaining tuition fees. They would not support her living expenses in a foreign city. They told her that they had not labored for decades so that their only daughter could squander her intellect on fairy tales and village folklore. The words spoken that night were heavier and sharper than any stones. They were the kind of words that cut deep into the marrow of a young girl's identity, things Amina would spend the rest of her days trying to forget, though she knew the scars would remain permanent. The confrontation had ended with her mother standing tall, her face a mask of disappointment, uttering the final ultimatum. If your mind is set on being a penniless writer of old tales, you will do it somewhere else, not with our money, and not under our roof. Amina did not argue. She had learned from a very young age that confronting her parents' rigid worldview was like shouting at a granite boulder. The boulder does not shift its weight, and your voice only grows hoarse in the wind. She simply retreated to her small bedroom and wrote in her personal journal for hours, her pen flying across the paper as she processed the grief, the anger, and the terrifying spark of independence that had just been struck within her soul. She graduated from her secondary school that June, and 2 weeks later, on the precise morning of her 18th birthday, the hammer fell. She came down the stairs expecting nothing, only to find her plastic suitcase packed, zipped, and waiting by the front entrance. Rested on top of the handle was a handwritten note from her mother, written in the precise, clinical cursive of a hospital matron. Amina, we love you, but we cannot sit back and watch you ruin your future with these foolish choices. When you are ready to be serious about a real career and a real life, you know where to find us. Tucked beneath the note was a small brown paper envelope. Inside were several crisp banknotes totaling exactly 2,000 Kenyan shillings, the equivalent of about $35 at the time. Amina read the note once, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She read it a second time, letting the cold finality of the ink sink into her mind. Then, without shedding a single tear in that house, she picked up the heavy suitcase, grabbed a small canvas tote bag that contained her writing journals, and walked out of the front door without looking back. For 3 agonizing days, she lived in a cramped, noisy youth hostel near the Eldoret bus terminal. The hostel cost a few hundred shillings a night, a price that meant her small inheritance of 2,000 shillings was evaporating with terrifying speed. She tried looking for immediate work as a clerk or a tutor, but the town was flooded with school leavers searching for the exact same opportunities. She even walked to a local post office to place a trunk call to the institute in Dar es Salaam, begging the admissions office if there was any possibility of obtaining a full scholarship based on financial distress. The secretary on the other end of the crackling telephone line was polite but unyielding. Without her parents' signatures and proof of income for the formal grant applications, the institute could not extend further aid. On the morning of the 4th day, Amina sat in the communal courtyard of the hostel, surrounded by the smell of diesel exhaust from the nearby bus stage and the loud shouting of market touts. She had exactly 1,200 shillings left in her pocket, roughly $20. She had no job, no prospects, no university to go to, and no family she could call for rescue. All she possessed was a bag of notebooks, her pens, and a heavy brass ring with a tiny green malachite stone wrapped around her right index finger. The ring had belonged to her maternal grandmother, Neka, who had been the most important anchor of Amina's childhood. Neka had lived far away in a remote coastal village, but she had traveled to Eldoret every single year, staying for weeks at a time. She would fill the sterile, modern Okoro house with the rich, earthy scent of traditional coconut stews, the sound of her booming, unrestrained laughter, and the magical cadence of ancient folk tales. Neka was the one who had taught Amina to listen to the whispers of the wind, to pay attention to the behavior of the birds before a great storm, and to respect the history woven into the soil. When Neka passed away when Amina was 14, Amina had been forbidden from attending the burial because her parents claimed the journey to the coast was too expensive and would disrupt her school terminal exams. It was a betrayal that had fractured something fundamental inside Amina's chest, a wound that had never truly closed. The only thing she had left of her grandmother was that brass malachite ring, given to her on Neka's final visit. "This ring possesses its own wisdom, my child," the old woman had whispered, sliding it onto Amina's finger. "One day, it will guide your feet to a place you never expected. Listen to it." Sitting in the dust of the hostel yard, Amina unconsciously twirled the malachite ring. She opened a local daily newspaper she had bought with her remaining coins, turning to the back pages where small property advertisements were listed. She wasn't looking for a house in the expensive suburbs of Eldoret or Nairobi. She was searching for a miracle, any place where she could lay her head without her funds completely disappearing. That was when her eyes caught a bizarre, tiny notice near the bottom of a column, placed by a rural district cooperative in Malindi, along the far northern coast of Kenya. The advertisement stated that the local community trust was disposing of several ancient, abandoned properties in a remote, coastal village called Gede, situated deep within the maritime forests. The village had suffered from severe depopulation over the decades as the youth fled to Mombasa for tourism jobs, leaving behind historic structures that were falling into ruin. To encourage anyone, particularly writers, artisans, or cultural preservationists, to move back and breathe life into the dying settlement, the trust was offering an old, abandoned coralstone cottage for a token fee of exactly 150 shillings. At the current exchange rate of 1994, it was practically a $2 house. There were strict conditions, of course. The buyer had to legally register as a resident of the village, commit to living on the property, and promise to restore or preserve the structure within 5 years without destroying its traditional Swahili Arab architecture. Amina stared at the small print. 150 shillings. It was a sum so insignificant that most people would have laughed it off as a scam or a joke. The description itself was completely honest about the hardships involved. No electricity grid access, footpath access only through the baobab grove, water to be drawn from an ancient communal well. The cottage had been entirely abandoned since the mid-1950s. Amina touched the cool green malachite stone on her finger. Gede was on the coast, the very region her grandmother had loved, a place thick with history, myths, and the ghosts of ancient traders. She looked down at her remaining money. If she took a third-class, overnight train from Nairobi down to Mombasa, and then a cramped local bus up the coast to Malindi, she would have just enough to pay the token fee for the cottage and keep a few hundred shillings for basic rations of maize meal and beans. She had her notebooks, her laptop was a luxury she didn't own, but she had her pens, her sharp mind, and her grandmother's blessing. Rings no things, she whispered to herself, repeating Neka's words. 2 days later, Amina boarded the train, leaving the highlands behind as she set off toward the ancient, whispering forests of the coast. The local bus dropped her off at a dusty junction off the main coastal road at dawn. The air here was entirely different from the crisp, dry air of Eldoret. It was thick, heavy with the scent of salt, rotting mangrove fields, and the sweet, intoxicating perfume of blooming jasmine. She walked the remaining distance to the local community cooperative office, her plastic suitcase rattling loudly over the roots of giant mango trees that lined the path. The cooperative office was a small, whitewashed Swahili building with a rusty corrugated iron roof, situated next to an old mosque whose minaret had long been reclaimed by wild vines. Inside, sitting behind a heavy wooden desk beneath a faded calendar from 1991, was an elderly woman named Mama Fatma. She wore a beautifully patterned blue lasso wrapped around her shoulders, her face etched with deep lines of wisdom, and her sharp eyes peering over a pair of reading glasses. Mama Fatma looked at the newspaper clipping Amina placed on the desk. Then she looked up, studying Amina's youthful, dust-covered face, her modern Highland clothing, and the unmistakable look of exhaustion in her eyes. The old Mwenda cottage? Mama Fatma asked, her voice carrying the slow, melodic cadence of the coast. Child, you have traveled all the way from the Rift Valley for a ruin that has been swallowed by the jungle since the days of the emergency. Yes, Mama, Amina replied firmly, though her knees were trembling from the long journey. I want to live there. I want to restore it. I am a writer, and I need a place where I can write our stories. Mama Fatma stared at her for a long, silent minute, the only sound in the office being the slow ticking of a battery-operated clock on the wall. A gentle, knowing smile broke across the old woman's face. For 20 years I have sat at this desk, and usually, the only people who ask about these old abandoned ruins are land speculators from Mombasa or foreign tourists looking to dig up ancient pottery fragments, she said softly. You do not look like either of those. She leaned forward, her expression turning serious. But I must warn you, my daughter. It is a hard place. The roof of palm thatch is entirely gone. The coral rag walls are strong, but they are covered in vines and bats. There is no power. The snakes love the old foundations, and the nearest neighbors are a mile away through the forest path. Are you truly certain you have the strength for this? I have nowhere else to go, Mama, Amina said honestly, her voice barely a whisper. Mama Fatma looked down at the official deed forms on her desk, then reached into her own basket and pulled out a 150-shilling note, sliding it across the wood alongside the papers. Keep your coins, daughter, she said, patting Amina's hand. You will need every cent you have to buy food and lime for the mortar. I will pay the token fee to the cooperative registry myself. Welcome to Gede, Amina Okoro. May the ancestors guide your pen. The walk to her new home was a journey through a living graveyard of history. The path wound deep into the sacred Kaya forest, where massive, ancient baobab trees stood like grey giants against the blue sky, their trunks so wide it would take 10 men to encircle them. The ground was littered with the fragments of 16th century stone walls, remnants of a lost Swahili civilization that had been abandoned centuries ago to the jungle. When Amina finally reached the clearing where her cottage stood, she stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The building was small, a rectangular structure built from rough-cut blocks of white coral rag and lime mortar, traditional to the coastal region. It was missing its entire roof, the old mangrove poles that once supported the thatch having rotted away decades ago, leaving the interior open to the canopy of wild fig trees above. A single, beautifully carved Swahili wooden door hung loosely on rusted iron hinges, its detailed geometric patterns obscured by layers of grey dust and cobwebs. Wild jasmine and thorny bougainvillea had grown into thick, impenetrable walls along the southern side of the structure, their vibrant pink flowers casting a strange, surreal beauty over the ancient ruin. Amina walked forward, pushed open the heavy wooden door, which protested with a loud, scraping groan, and stepped inside. The floor was made of large, uneven slabs of local grey stone, entirely covered in decades of dried leaves, bat droppings, and the fine white dust of crumbling coral. The interior walls were rough, textured, and beautiful in their decay, showing the imprints of the ancient masons who had built them. At the far end of the single room sat the hearth. It was an immense, traditional cooking fireplace, built deep into the coral wall with an iron rod still fixed across the top for hanging clay pots. The stones inside the hearth were completely blackened, stained by a century of wood smoke and long-forgotten family meals. Amina walked toward the fireplace, her footsteps echoing strangely in the roofless room. Directly in front of the hearth opening was a massive, single slab of dark volcanic river stone, completely out of place among the white coral blocks of the house. It was a hearthstone about 5 feet wide, smooth from generations of women kneeling upon it to tend to the cooking fires. Amina knelt on the dusty floor, extending her right hand and pressing her palm flat against the dark stone. The stone was ice-cold despite the tropical heat outside. She sat there for a long time, her eyes closed, listening to the monkeys chattering in the baobab canopy above and the distant, rhythmic crash of the Indian Ocean waves against the reef. She was 18 years old, entirely alone, with nothing but a few shillings and her grandmother's ring. When she finally opened her eyes and lifted her palm, she noticed something peculiar. Along the back edge of the massive volcanic stone, where it met the coral rag wall, there was a distinct, clean gap. It wasn't a fracture caused by the settling of the earth or the roots of the forest trees. It was a deliberate, straight line, completely clear of the thick lime mortar that bound every other stone in the floor. Intrigued, Amina used her fingers to scrape away the decades of packed ash and dirt from the crevice. The edge of the stone was perfectly smooth, cut with deliberate precision so that it sat loose within its cradle. She pressed her entire weight down on the far left corner of the stone. Nothing happened. She moved to the opposite corner and pressed down firmly. The massive slab rocked, just a fraction of an inch, with a muffled, hollow thud. It was resting on a space. Excitement flashing through her veins, Amina ran out into the overgrown clearing. She searched through the wild brush until she found a thick, heavy length of iron scrap metal, likely an old axle from a long-abandoned tractor. Returning to the hearth, she managed to wedge the flattened end of the iron bar deep into the gap beneath the volcanic stone. Using her entire body weight as leverage, she threw herself against the bar. The heavy stone groaned, resisting at first, before slowly rising on its side. It was incredibly heavy, easily weighing over 200 pounds, but with the mechanical advantage of the iron bar, Amina managed to tip it backward, letting it rest heavily against the back of the fireplace. Beneath the hearthstone lay a perfectly constructed, stone-lined chamber. It was a rectangular vault, roughly 3 feet long and 2 feet deep, completely insulated from the dampness of the earth by thick layers of dried palm leaves and resin. Resting inside the dark cavity was a large, heavy bundle wrapped entirely in thick, waxed oilcloth and tied securely with multiple knots of coarse coconut fiber rope. Amina's hands shook as she reached into the dark chamber and lifted the bundle out. It was surprisingly heavy, making her muscles strain. She carried it over to a small, intact stone ledge near the window, brushing away the cobwebs before setting it down. The oilcloth was stiff and blackened with age and soot, but it had done its job perfectly. The fabric was completely intact, protecting whatever treasures lay sealed within since the mid-century. With trembling fingers, Amina pried open the coarse knots and carefully unfolded the layers of protective cloth. Inside the bundle were 3 distinct items: a small, tarnished brass box with an intricate filigree latch, a thick, leather-bound ledger with yellowed pages, and a beautiful traditional necklace made of polished amber beads and silver coins. She opened the brass box first. Inside, wrapped in soft silk that had surprisingly preserved its color, were several stunning pieces of antique Swahili jewelry. There were heavy silver bridal cuffs carved with Arabic inscriptions, a pair of delicate gold earrings set with deep red garnets, and a magnificent gold locket. Amina carefully pried the locket open with her fingernail. Inside was a tiny, faded black and white photograph of a young couple. The man wore the sharp, high-collared uniform of a colonial-era clerk, his moustache perfectly trimmed, while the woman beside him was breathtakingly beautiful, draped in a rich, embroidered coastal silk kanga, looking solemnly into the camera lens with wide, intelligent eyes. Amina set the jewelry down, her heart racing, and reached for the leather ledger. The leather was cracked, but the binding held firm. As she opened the first page, the unmistakable scent of old paper and dried ink filled the air. The text was written in English, executed in a beautiful, precise, and elegant cursive hand that spoke of an elite education. The first entry was dated October 14, 1939. "My name is Mora Mwenda," the text read. "My husband, Bilal, and I are closing our home in Gede tonight. The Great War in Europe has reached our shores, and Bilal has been conscripted as a translator for the King's African Rifles. Foolish man that he is, he believes he must help fight the fires of the world before they consume our own coast. I am leaving to work as a medical assistant at the Port Hospital in Mombasa. We do not know if the tides of history will ever allow us to return to this sanctuary. I am hiding this ledger, our life savings, and the ancestral jewelry of Bilal's grandmother beneath the great volcanic Hearth stone. It is the exact location where my own grandmother used to hide our family's grain and valuables during the raids of the early days. If we survive this darkness and return, we shall reclaim what is ours. But if the forest swallows us, let these treasures remain hidden until they are uncovered by someone who truly needs them. The heart holds what the heart cannot carry." Amina felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she read the words. She turned the pages carefully, reading subsequent entries that had been written irregularly over the long war years. Mora had returned to the cottage briefly in 1942 while on leave from her hospital duties, noting that Bilal was stationed far away in the jungles of Burma. She had added more funds to the vault during that visit. In 1945, a short, devastating entry was written in a ragged, tear-stained hand. "Bilal is gone. Killed during the final campaigns in Burma. The world has found peace, but my house is entirely dark. I shall try to live on." The final entry in the book was dated May 3, 1953. "I am walking out of this door for the very last time today. I am 63 years old, and my body can no longer fight the jungle or draw the heavy water from the deep well. My cousin has sent for me from London, and I am boarding a ship to start a new life where the memories do not haunt every corner. I do not have the emotional strength to dig up what lies beneath the fireplace. The silver and gold belong to Bilal's family, and the currency represents our hard work and his military pension. I leave it all for whoever inherits this cottage next. Whoever you are, you will be a stranger to my blood, but you will not be a stranger to this sacred space. This house will know your spirit if you truly deserve to stay. I pray it treats you gently. Mora Mwenda." Amina closed the ledger, her eyes filled with tears. She looked back down into the oilcloth bundle, reaching into its deepest recess. There, tucked inside a secondary pouch of woven palm fiber, was a massive stack of historical banknotes. There were hundreds of East African shillings from the colonial era, crisp and perfectly preserved, alongside old British pound notes and post-war currency issued in the 1940s. In the modern collectors' markets of 1994, these rare, uncirculated colonial banknotes and pristine antique Swahili silver jewelry were worth an absolute fortune. To a young girl who had walked into the forest with nothing but $20 and a broken heart, it was an astronomical sum that would change her life forever. Amina did not sleep in the roofless cottage that first night, for the clouds were heavy with the threat of coastal rain. She walked back to the village junction and rented a small, secure room above a local Swahili cafe for a few shillings. As she sat there eating a simple plate of spiced rice, listening to the elders discuss the evening news around an old radio, she wrote furiously in her notebook. She knew that she was no longer an outcast. She had been chosen by history, guided by her grandmother's ring to a hearth that had been waiting 70 years just to save her. The morning after her discovery, the heavy tropical rain finally came, washing over the ancient Kaya forest and turning the dusty paths of Gede into streams of bright red mud. Amina sat by the window of the small Swahili cafe, the leather-bound ledger open before her. As the rain beat a rhythmic tattoo against the corrugated iron roof, she began to strategize. She knew that the historical banknotes and antique silver cuffs were a miraculous lifeline, but she also knew she had to be incredibly careful. An 18-year-old girl appearing out of nowhere with rare colonial-era treasure would immediately arouse suspicion, or worse, attract the attention of thieves. She decided to seek the counsel of the one person who had shown her kindness, Mama Fatma at the community cooperative. Later that afternoon, when the storm cleared into a brilliant, humid blue sky, Amina walked back to the cooperative office, carrying the brass filigree box wrapped tightly in a modest kanga fabric. Mama Fatma was alone, sipping a cup of spiced black tea. When Amina closed the door and carefully revealed the contents of the box and the pages of the ledger, the old woman's eyes went wide. She adjusted her reading glasses, her hands trembling as she touched the silver bridle cuffs. Subhanallah, Mama Fatma whispered, a tear forming at the edge of her eye. I remember Mora Mwenda. I was just a little girl when she boarded the bus to Mombasa to catch the ship to England. Everyone in the village thought she had sold everything to pay for her passage. Nobody knew she had left her heart under the hearth. Mama Fatma looked at Amina with a fierce, protective maternal instinct. Listen to me, child. You must not take these to the local market brokers in Malindi. They will cheat you and tell the whole province what you found. My brother-in-law is an honest antiquities dealer and appraiser for the National Museums in Mombasa. I will take you to him myself on Saturday. We will handle this legally, and we will ensure Mora's legacy is respected. True to her word, Mama Fatma escorted Amina down the coast to Mombasa that weekend. The appraiser was a dignified, elderly gentleman who was utterly spellbound by the pristine condition of the collection. Because the ledger explicitly proved Mora Mwenda's intent to pass the property and its hidden contents to the next legal owner of the cottage, Amina's ownership was indisputable. The museum cooperative offered to purchase the rare colonial banknotes and 2 of the historical silver pieces for a permanent cultural exhibition. When the transaction was finalized, Amina walked out of the bank in Mombasa with a newly opened savings account containing more money than her parents made in an entire year. She was no longer a penniless outcast clinging to a dream. She was an independent woman with the means to build her own kingdom. Yet, despite her sudden wealth, Amina did not buy a modern apartment in Mombasa or a fancy car. Her heart belonged to the clearing in the forest. She returned to Gede and immediately hired a crew of local craftsmen, masons who still knew the ancient art of mixing lime mortar from crushed coral and carpenters who could carve traditional mangrove beams. For the next 6 months, the clearing around the old Mwenda cottage echoed with the sounds of laughter, hammering, and the rhythmic singing of the local workers. Amina worked alongside them, her hands becoming calloused as she helped mix the lime and clear the wild bougainvillea. They built a magnificent, high-peaked roof thatched with tightly woven palm fronds, known locally as makuti, which kept the interior perfectly cool even during the hottest coastal afternoons. The beautifully carved Swahili door was painstakingly restored, its geometric patterns brought back to life with linseed oil. Amina left the immense volcanic hearth stone exactly as she had found it, but she kept the deep vault beneath it empty, treating it as a sacred monument to the woman who had saved her. As the cottage transformed, so did Amina's place in the village. The local people, who had initially viewed the quiet Highland girl with skepticism, saw her dedication to preserving their history. They began to stop by the cottage in the evenings, bringing gifts of fresh coconuts, grilled fish, and ripe mangoes. The village elders would sit on the stone veranda Amina had built, drinking local coffee and sharing the very folk tales, historical accounts, and oral traditions that Amina's parents had dismissed as useless fairy tales. Amina listened to every word. With a small, battery-powered word processor she had purchased in Mombasa, she began to write. She wove the stories of the coastal spirits, the history of the ancient Gede ruins, the tragic love story of Mora and Bilal, and her own journey from the highlands into a beautiful, sprawling manuscript of creative nonfiction and cultural poetry. By the time the short rains of late 1994 arrived, her manuscript was complete. She sent it to a major publishing house in Nairobi that specialized in African literature. 6 months later, just as she was approaching her 19th birthday, a heavy package arrived at the Malindi post office. Amina opened it on the steps of the cooperative office with Mama Fatma watching proudly. Inside were 20 advance copies of a beautifully bound book. The cover featured an artistic rendering of a white coral cottage framed by giant baobab trees. The title read, The Hearth Holds the Heart, Tales of the Kaya Forest, by Amina Okoro. The book became a national sensation, praised by critics for capturing the fading soul of the coastal traditions and celebrating the resilient spirit of African womanhood. The royalties from the book's sales ensured that Amina would never have to worry about financial stability again. One evening, shortly after her book launch, Amina sat by her restored fireplace. A small, crackling wood fire warmed the room, casting dancing shadows against the smooth white coral walls. She looked down at the brass malachite ring on her index finger, then glanced at the leather ledger of Mora Mwenda, which now sat safely in a glass display case on her desk. She thought of her parents back in Eldoret. A few weeks prior, she had sent them a copy of her book along with a brief, polite note letting them know she was safe, happy, and thriving. She hadn't received a response, and she realized that she no longer needed one. The anger and resentment that had burnt in her chest on her 18th birthday had completely evaporated, replaced by a deep, profound peace. Her parents had cast her out because they believed that blood and traditional careers were the only anchors that could keep a person safe in a harsh world. But Amina had learned a different truth, a truth woven into the very fabric of the African soil. The truest bond is not always the way of blood but the way of recognition. Mora Mwenda had recognized something across the decades, the possibility of another young woman who would need exactly what she had to offer, and she had trusted the old stone cottage to hold her gifts until that woman arrived. The cottage had done its duty perfectly. It had shielded the treasure from the jungle, the rains, and the passage of 70 years, waiting patiently for the right spirit to step through its door. Amina leaned forward, running her fingers along the smooth, cool edge of the volcanic hearthstone. The hearth holds what the heart cannot carry. Mora had written those words in the shadow of a world war, and Amina finally understood their true depth. Some burdens, some griefs, and some dreams are simply too heavy to carry through a single lifetime. They must be set down somewhere safe. And a hearth, the place of warmth, the place where families gather, where food is shared, and where stories are birthed, is the best place in the world to leave them. What is set down in a sacred space does not disappear. It waits. It waits for the next chosen stranger who dares to lift it. Amina Okoro had been 18 years old, cast out by her family with nothing but a handful of coins and a notebook. She had used the last of her strength to claim a $2 ruin in a forgotten forest, and it had turned out to be the greatest inheritance she could ever receive. She closed her eyes, listening to the gentle rustle of the palm thatch roof in the coastal breeze, knowing that she was finally, truly, home. Thank you for coming along on this journey to bring Amina's story to life. We took the heart of your original script, the painful eviction, the leap of faith across the country, the mystery beneath the volcanic hearthstone, and the beautiful parallel between two women separated by generations, and transformed it into a rich, atmospheric African folk tale set in the vibrant landscape of 1990s coastal Kenya. Amina's story reminds us that when we are cast out by the things we know, we are often being guided toward the places where we truly belong. The legacy of Neka's ring and Mora Mwenda's hidden hearth proved that some inheritances aren't passed down through bloodlines but are left waiting in the soil for the souls brave enough to find them. Before we wrap up, if Amina's journey moved you and you love discovering hidden histories, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear a story about resilience and destiny today. And now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever found an old, forgotten object that made you feel connected to a total stranger? Or perhaps you have an old family tale passed down through generations. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We love reading where you're watching from and how far these stories travel. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.